Today we'll be going over the AP exam, which is like basically a review of last time with a couple tips and tricks for any sort of review guide if you would want, if you think it might be useful. Also, then afterwards I'll be going over a summary of all the content of the AP Psychology course. So I'll be going unit by unit through the thing, and I don't think there will be many questions on the summary of the content just because you probably haven't learned it before. So it's probably just an introduction or some interesting facts. I will have, so this way I will have answer a question and answer session right after the AP my review session of the exam. So that I'll say that again once we get there, but you can ask questions throughout the presentation if you would like, or just during the special Q&A section. So what is in the AP Psychology exam? This was aside from last presentation, but this exam contains two parts, a multiple choice question part and a free response question part. You have 100 questions to complete in 70 minutes for the multiple choice questions, and it's worth 2/3 of your final grade. For the free response, you have two questions. One is concept application and the other is research design, and each one is split into around 8 different sections, and you have 50 minutes to complete this FRQ section. This is only worth 1/3 of your final grade. So, some commonly occurring questions in the AP Psychology exam are correlation graphs, brain geography, and any sort of scenario questions that give you some scenario and ask you to identify a mental illness. This also plays into the brain geography section if it asks you for any sort of certain section of the brain. This is definitely not everything that's covered in there, but these are just some commonly reoccurring questions that may show up, that shows up pretty much on every single exam. So correlation graphs, I'll talk about them a little bit later, but they're just graphs that show correlation. Okay, so suggested ways to study. Definitely do not wait till the last week. That's a terrible idea. You're probably gonna not get that much sleep and be very stressful. So I suggest you start studying at least a month in advance, just so you can be able to review all your information and feel confident about the stuff that you may not have started out to feel confident on. You should also try reviewing unit by unit. This will just ensure that you are able to cover every single subject and make sure that you're not forgetting anything that is going to be tested. Use resources like Kahoot or Quizlet. They're pretty fun in my opinion, and they also allow you to help hammer in whatever you need into your memory. It's much better than just reading over your notes or just reading the textbook or something, and it's also much more engaging, so it works your brain a little bit more. Also go over any previous tests. You don't want to walk into the exam just not knowing how everything's going to be formatted. So just make sure you do practice free responses and multiple choices, just so you know how you should sort your time specifically for yourself, and maybe what you need to be worried about or keep an eye on. So here's some personal tips and tricks for both the multiple choice and the free response portion. So for the multiple choice portion, if you don't know a question, you should skip it. So I think for multiple choice, if you can't get a question in less than a minute, because you have less than a minute to usually do each problem, then you should just skip it and then come back to it later or at the end of the exam once you finish the entire test. So of course, if you're not really great at remembering which questions you skipped, this might not be a great choice for you. But for me, I typically just leave it blank, because blank bubbles in. You can easily see it on your bubble in sheet, and then you can come back to it if you did forget. Also, you can usually automatically rule out 2 of the answer choices. So if you have to guess, it's better to have a 50% chance of getting it right than a 25% chance. Okay, so for the free response section, make sure you keep track of your time. This is an important part of the multiple choice portion as well, but free response, because you're writing sentences or paragraphs about your answer, if you lose your track of time, then it's going to really go downhill, because unlike multiple choice where you can fill in bubbles really fast, for free response, you actually have to think about the thing and write down your entire answer. So I suggest you first read your entire situation, and then all of the things that you will have to write about, like the vocab words, before you actually start to write. So don't just like see one question and then just immediately start writing, because sometimes later terms can help you understand the first questions or so. Also, for free response, which is a little bit different from multiple choice, is that if you don't know the answer, I actually just suggest just writing as much as possible in a short amount of time, just to have a chance of putting down the right stuff. There's like some specific formatting that you'll have to do for the free response on the test. So just, and it's kind of awkward if because you're trying to like keep your stuff in lines and spaces and stuff, it's kind of awkward to try to like estimate how much room you'll have to need and then run out of room or something. So just write as much as possible. You don't need to come back. It's probably not worth that much anyways. Also, keep your sentences short and information condensed. There's no need to use filler words or flowy language, because the readers, they aren't grading an English paper. You don't need to add any sort of special ways to format your sentences. Just best to keep them short and all your information in there. Do make sure that your handwriting is readable, and also make sure that your sentences make sense, because if the reader can't read your stuff or they can't understand what you wrote, then there's no way you can get points on that. So also, this is just typical when you're writing down vocab words, just underline the vocab word, just so your reader knows where the question is being answered. It just guides them to the right spot and probably will help them with giving you a good score. So now we're going to move on to the AP Psychology course content. I'm not going to read through all of these units because I'll read them during the title slides when I go over them. And I'll also have the percentages on the slides later, but the percentages are just how much this section is tested on the AP exam. So now we'll be moving into specific units. If you have any questions on stuff that I've already gone over, feel free to drop them in the chat. I'll just go ahead and start going over the units. If you need to type out a question, go for it. So Unit 1 is Scientific Foundations of Psychology. So this unit is basically just history of psychology and important people, as well as some just scientific research basic stuff. So you'll hear a lot about schools of thought in psychology. So schools of thought are basically they're categorizations of psychologists. So each category has like a certain type group of people that they either are most interested in a certain prospect of psychology, or they think one area is more important, or they're only focusing on one part. So for example, psychoanalytical, which is the first bullet point under the later school of thoughts point. So psychoanalytical is very based on like unconscious stuff like dreams and whatever, and that's what all psychoanalytics focused on. So I'm not going to be going over this, but if you do take the course, this will all be in a lot of detail. So here are some important people that aren't really associated with any other specific unit of psychology. For example, like on here, the most important person is probably Wilhelm Wundt. He was a German psychologist that is known as the father of modern psychology. This is because he was the first person to actually found a psychological lab and perform a psychology experiment. His experiment was fairly simple, just seeing the timeline between hearing a ball drop on a platform and clicking some sort of computer key. So now we move on to the research methods portion. So like I said, this portion is mostly just basic scientific things that you should have already learned in a basic science class, like experiments, what they are, an independent and dependent variable, how to format them on a graph, stuff like that. Here are some terms that are related with experiments. This is this is pretty specific to psychology, but for all of these terms, I'll be giving an example of if there was a treatment being made, a medicine being made, and let's say, and there are two groups of participants. So the medicine, let's call it pill A, and then there's a placebo called pill B. So during the placebo effect, so a placebo is like a false or a fake drug that's not actually the real thing. So maybe just like a sugar pill or something without any actual medicine in it. So the placebo effect just shows behaviors associated with the experimental group when they receive the placebo. So when they receive the fake drug. Somebody asked me to go back a slide. I'll go right back after I finish going over this. So double blind is when neither the experimenter nor the participant knows what group of participants got the placebo. So for example, with this medication, let's say pill A is the real thing, right? So the doctor doesn't know if the patient is getting pill A or the fake pill. So this way they can't have any sort of influence on, like unconscious influence, and like kind of conveying to the patient which drug they're getting. For single blind, only the participants don't know which drug they're getting, because this is usually used when the experimenter can't be blind, aka when they're testing for, like, they're only giving pill A to a certain gender, or they're only giving pill A to a certain age group. It's just very it's very obvious to tell which patients are getting which, so they can't be blind to this, to who's getting what. So I'll go back a slide. So again, this is just a slide on variables and just experiments. Okay, so moving on. Continuing on research methods. So like I said earlier, correlation graphs. So there's a positive, negative, and no correlation. So to just remember, this is pretty important. Correlation only goes from 1 to -1. The highest correlations are on the ends. So the highest correlations are either closest to 1 or closest to -1. And then the lowest amount of correlation is close to 0. These are also more statistical stuff that's important in research. But another big thing in psychology is ethical guidelines, because you're testing with people and not like bacteria or something. It's very important to know the ethical guidelines if you're planning on doing some sort of experiment or something. Okay, moving on. So now we'll be moving on to biological bases of behavior. So in this unit is mostly about biology of the brain. The brain, of course, it's psychology, so the brain is a very big portion of this biology stuff. There's also stuff like the nervous system, but again, it's mostly biology of your brain and how it is structured. So firstly, neurons. So neurons are basically, they're the bases of the entire nervous system. It is it has a cell body and then an axon. So these axons have axon terminals, while the cell body has dendrites connected. So the message that transmits from neuron to neuron is called an action potential. So the action potential travels from the dendrites all the way down the axon to the axon terminals. So on the bottom right picture, you can see how there are multiple neurons. So on here, you can see how the axons connect to the dendrites, and then so when the message is going through, the message will go through the axon terminals and then go to the receiving dendrites. So a good analogy for this is that axons speak while dendrites listen. Of course, they're not actually speaking, but it's just a good analogy and a good way to remember. So if you notice on the previous slide, the axons and dendrites don't actually connect. So the gap between these two is called a synapse. So the synapse is just a gap between an axon and a dendrite. So in this synapse is where the axon will send particles called neurotransmitters through this gap, and then the dendrite will have receptors and then receive the signal and then continue the message on. So on the left are some terms that are related to synapse and any of these receptors or stuff, but I won't be going into detail. So here we go, the nervous system. The nervous system is a big part of psychology, and it is split into two different big branches, which is the central nervous system and the peripheral nervous system. So the central nervous system consists of the brain and the spinal cord, so just the bodily stuff. And then the peripheral nervous system is then split into somatic nervous system and autonomic nervous system. So the somatic nervous system controls like involuntary muscle movements, like raising your hand or moving your fingers, stuff like that. While the autonomic nervous system is like automatic functions, stuff like your heartbeat, your breathing, your digestion, things like that. So two of the most important branches are the sympathetic division of the nervous system and the parasympathetic division. So the parasympathetic division is what your body is like operating under during normal circumstances, while the sympathetic division is when your body is preparing for fight or flight. So an example of fight or flight is if you were hiking in the woods and you encountered a big bear. So fight or flight is the bodily response to either fight something or run away. So when you encounter this bear, your body will be aroused by this sympathetic division of the nervous system, and it will start doing things like quickening your heartbeat, dilating your pupils, increasing your breathing, stuff like that, so that it's getting you ready to either run away or fight that bear that you encountered. So neurotransmitters. The nervous system transmits information with neurotransmitters. So the neurotransmitters are just like the tiny particles that transmit all the information through neurons. So here's a list of important neurotransmitters, things like dopamine, which are important for like reward and movement. And you'll definitely go into these a lot more if you do take psychology. They're very important to how the nervous system functions. So moving on to brain structure. So the brain structure is usually categorized into lobes. So lobes are part of the cerebral cortex, which is just the outside portion of your brain. So there's the frontal lobe, which is important for your decision making and your personality and stuff. There's the parietal lobe, which is mostly for sensations, stuff like touch and feel. Then there's the occipital lobe, which is vision. So when your eyes bring in a sense, it transmits to the back of your brain to the occipital lobe, where it is then looked at and analyzed to produce the picture that you see. So then there's also the temporal lobe, which is important for facial recognition and hearing. On the very back, it's not a lobe, but it's known as the cerebellum, which is important for your movement and your balance, while the brainstem, which is not shown here, controls all your automatic functions like breathing, heartbeat, and digestion. So the brainstem is probably the place where you least want to get injured, because if you do get injured, there's a likelihood that you won't make it out. So an interesting experiment for just this brain study stuff is that there was this man named Phineas Gage. So this was a while ago, but he was like a well-respected man. He was a functioning member of society and did everything very well. But one day he had an accident on a railroad where a pole was shot through like one of his eyes and up through the frontal lobe, all the way through the other side of his head. Surprisingly, he did survive, but there was a big change in his personality. So he was once a quiet and a really good guy, but then he turned into a very reckless and aggressive person. Through this situation, scientists figured that the frontal lobe is what is the most important portion for decision making, because Phineas Gage, who was a normal person before, had turned into a very different person after his frontal lobe was damaged. So then, besides being categorized into lobes, the brain is also structured into the right hemisphere and the left hemisphere. So the right hemisphere of your brain controls the left side of your body, while the left side of your brain controls the right side of your body. It does get kind of confusing, but as long as you remember they're opposite, then it should be fine. In the left hemisphere, there's also a special area that controls your speech. So Broca's area and Wernicke's area both contribute to how you understand and produce speech. Then there's this important part in the middle of the brain called the corpus callosum, which connects the two hemispheres. This is not all of the brain structures, definitely not all of them, but these are just a couple that I think that are the biggest and most interesting. So anyways, the corpus callosum contributed to split brain experiments. So back then, when medical science was not as good as now, people who had bad seizures would just get the corpus callosum, they would get it cut, right down the middle of their brain. If it is cut, so now the two hemispheres of your brain are not connected anymore. And this is what brought about split brain experiments. So what's cool about split brain experiments is that, so let's say that there's a picture of a cat flashed on the left side of the eye. A person like you would be like, oh, it's a cat. But then a person with the split brain would see the cat, and if it was on the left side of their eye, then it would go to the right hemisphere of their brain. This means they can't say it out loud because their ability to produce speech is on the left hemisphere. But if you're asked to write it down with their left hand, they can. So that's what's interesting about split brains and how your brain is actually going between each other. The two hemispheres are always communicating between each other all the time. Okay, then nature versus nurture. So this is a big part of psychology. It used to be a very important debate. So it's just a debate on whether psychology is dependent on your nature, so like your genetics, or your nurture, like your upbringing. So to study this, most people looked at twin studies. So identical twins, which are almost like monozygotic twins, they have the exact same genetics, not accounting for any sort of mutations. Okay, so this means that if they are split, the difference in their environments show how they are affected. So that this shows how the environments affect people. So this is not ethical, especially not not in this day. But back then, if it was an orphanage or something, and twins got separated at birth, it showed how having genetics controls stuff like whether you get certain diseases or whether you're prone to certain sicknesses, while the environment, mostly your upbringing, mostly shows if you are prone to being an alcoholic, or if you will grow to be a smoker, or you have a good education, stuff like that. So in the end, both nature and nurture matter for psychology. So now we move on to the endocrine system. So like I said before, I mentioned that there's the nervous system. The endocrine system is the counter to that. So the endocrine system transmits messages through hormones in the blood. It's slow compared to the nervous system, but still relatively fast because it only takes a couple seconds. So there are some important parts of the endocrine system. I won't be going into much detail on that though. So a big part of this brain biology is having scans. Because you can't see your brain from the outside, scans are important to be able to know what's happening inside of them. So the scan that you probably heard the most of is MRI. It just comes up a lot, I think. But all of these scans are fairly important. So our teacher told us that if you're on the exam and it's asking you for a scan and you have no idea what it is, when in doubt, pick a PET scan. Okay, next. The next unit is sensation and perception. So sensation is your senses, while perception is how your brain interprets these senses. So here are just some terms that will be used. One interesting one, which is shown in a picture on the right side, is the perceptual set. So it's a tendency to see something as a part of a group. So let's say if you covered up the A and the C, that middle figure would look like a 13 because you cover up the A and the C and it looks like it's 12, 13, 14. But then if you covered up the 12 and the 14, you would see it as A, B, C. And so the middle figure would be a B, which is pretty cool, I think. Okay, so the visual system. There's a lot of eye anatomy talked about in psychology just because it's like connected to your brain, of course. And then I won't be going into detail on this, but you can always look at it on your own. Okay, so this is something that I find kind of interesting, which is the theories of color vision. So how do people see color? So there's the trichromatic theory. So it basically says cones, which are the things in our eyes that receive color signals. So each cone has a different color related to it. So blue, red, and green. So this helps explain color blindness as if you're colorblind for green, then you're missing the green cones. There's also opponent process theory, which is basically complementary colors are processed in the same type of cell. So this explains why we see an after image. Maybe you can try doing this after my explanations, after my lecture thingy. But if you stare at a red screen for like 30 seconds or so, and then you go and look at a white screen, there will be an after image of green on when you look at the white screen, which is pretty cool. Yeah, you could go try that, and it's pretty cool. Okay, then there's how both eyes make up a 3D image. So as you know, your eyes are in different places. So when you close one eye, the other eye will see slightly different image from if you close your left eye, your right eye would see a slightly different image than if you look with your left eye. So this is retinal disparity. This allows us to be able to perceive depth well. So if you do this and you don't really focus your eyes, it looks like your fingers are overlapping. So that's what retinal disparity is. Then there's convergence. It's just like the more something gets closer to your face, the more eye strain there is. Okay, so then auditory system. So this again is ear anatomy and stuff. There's the outer ear, which is the outside, and then there's the middle ear, and then the inner ear. One of the important parts is the cochlea. It's just where sound is first processed, and it comes up a lot. There's like a liquid fluid in the cochlea, and it like moves around to help you with your balance. So that's why people say that your ears help with your balance. Then there are some other senses that you will go into if you do take psychology. Okay, then there's the Gestalt psychology. So there's a whole paragraph about it, but basically it just shows it's a big part of sensation and perception. So figure ground is basically, it's not shown on the picture to the right, but figure ground is basically the difference between having something close up to your face, close to you, and then or in the background. So everything is split into the background or the foreground. Then there's similarity, which you can see on the first picture on the right. The first set is that it just shows that how people can perceive that these two things are similar. Then there's continuity, which is how you can still see this as a line, even though it's not actually a line. It's just a bunch of dots. There's also the law of Progan's. Okay, so here you can see, even though all the shape is one shape, you can see the individual circles without them having to be distinct. Okay, so also part of this unit is states of consciousness. So I'll move on to the next slide because these are just some terms. But first is sleep. So I think sleep is pretty interesting because people are always joking that they're not getting enough of it. But anyways, sleep is broken up to 3 stages, as well as rapid eye movement or REM sleep. So the entire cycle, not including REM sleep, takes about 90 minutes to go through. So if you would like to get like the best amount of sleep for the least amount of time, you probably can like find an interval of time with 90-minute cycles. But between each of these cycles, there is REM sleep. So REM sleep is where you're dreaming as well as processing all the things that happened in your day. So this is where cognitive processing happens. So this happens in between each cycle. If you get into sleep debt, like over a long period of time, like if you don't get enough sleep, then your REM will slowly, the cycle, the stages of sleep will be shorter, and then so you can make up on REM sleep. So for example, if a normal day you were 90 minutes for the cycle of sleep, then if you were in sleep debt, it maybe only take around 30 minutes for you to get into REM sleep. There's also this thing called circadian rhythm, which is our 24-hour biological clock. So it's why you feel sleepy at night, and that's why when you move to a different, or when you're going on vacation in a different country, you have jet lag. Your body is still not used to this new time zone, so you're still sleepy, like maybe in the middle of the day. Here are sleep disorders. You'll go into a lot of detail on these. They're pretty interesting to go into if you would like to do any sort of like personal research on them. So dream theories. So many of you, if you're thinking about psychology, may have heard of Sigmund Freud. So Freud was, some people think him as the founder of psychology. He was very important. He was also a kind of weird guy, but he's pretty interesting too. So he believed that your unconscious acted as a path into understanding your conscious mind. So he thought that dreams showed your unconscious wish fulfillment. So you would dream about things that you unconsciously wanted. So in these dreams, there's latent content, which is the hidden meaning of a dream, and manifest content, which is the obvious storyline. So in this, for example, if I had a dream about falling, the latent content, the manifest content would just be I'm falling. But the latent content may be like, oh, you're scared of losing control, so you would like to not lose control, or something like that. This is just an example of latent manifest content. Freud did not actually think like that. He was, again, a very weird guy, so he thought his theories were a bit different. So there are also psychoactive drugs. So if you take a health class, you'll learn about depressants and stimulants. So depressants are just decreasing your sympathetic nervous system. They slow down your brain basically, and make you have like slower reaction times and stuff like that. Stimulants are things that increase your nervous system. When I think of stimulants, a lot of the time I think of like caffeine, because it's something that we're all exposed to, and it just like it lets you get like super hyper and stuff. So there's also tolerance, and then dependence, and then withdrawal, which are all part of this drug theory stuff. Okay, moving on to learning. So the whole unit is basically about I think the whole unit is very interesting, so that's what I will be talking about in this, but there's also a lot of other content that I won't be talking about. So anyway, moving on. So first we talk about classical conditioning. So there's the very typical, I feel like a lot of people have heard of this, the dog training conditioning learning. So this is classical conditioning. There was an experiment performed by Ivan Pavlov about training a dog to salivate even when there's not food. So basically what happened was that Pavlov, before doing any of the training / conditioning, he would bring out food. So when he brought out food, the dog would salivate. And then he'd have a tuning fork or sometimes a bell. So if he hit the bell, the dog would have no reaction. So during conditioning, he would hit the bell every time he brought out any food. So the dog would slowly associate the bell to being food. So after the conditioning, he when he did ring the bell, the dog would salivate without the food being present. This is not ethical by today's standards, but like this was a long time ago, so yeah. Anyways, some important terms to know for this experiment specifically and any sort of classical conditioning is you have unconditioned stimulus and an unconditioned response, a neutral response, and then you have the conditioned stimulus and the conditioned response. The names are pretty self-explanatory, but they do get kind of confusing sometimes. Okay. There was another big experiment in classical conditioning, which is the Little Albert experiment. So this experiment was conducted by John Watson. So basically what happened was that there was this baby who probably real name was not Albert, but was called Little Albert. So basically what happened was they trained him to cry when he saw a white rat. So basically when they took out the white rat at the very beginning, the baby had no response. But then when there was a loud noise, the baby would cry. So then every time he brought out the white rat, he would also hit a loud noise, and then this slowly conditioned the baby to cry whenever he saw the rat. More generalization on this was that besides also being afraid of white rats now, the baby also, when he came into contact with any sort of like small white fuzzy object, like a white jacket or like a small purse or something, he would also cry. This is definitely not ethical, so don't try this at home. So, okay, then we move on to a different type of conditioning, which is operant conditioning. So it's conditioning by using punishment and reinforcement. So there's positive reinforcement, negative reinforcement, positive punishment, and negative punishment. So basically, reinforcement is anything that is to increase a behavior, while punishment is anything to try to decrease a behavior, and anything positive, like positive reinforcement, positive punishment, is when you're adding something or giving something, while negative is you're taking something away. These are pretty confusing in my opinion. Sometimes it's hard to tell, but as long as you know these rules, then it's pretty good. It's pretty simple afterwards. So there are also these, what I find interesting about operant conditioning is this over justification effect. This is basically when you're reinforcing something that somebody already intrinsically wanted to do, and that causes them to stop doing it. So the example up there is if your child likes reading, if you give them $5 for reading, then they'll stop reading on their own because they'll be expecting $5. That's just something interesting. I don't think it's that important, important for AP, but it's just a cool fact. Okay, now moving back to AP stuff. So there are different schedules. These are more confusing than the punishment reward stuff. So there's fixed ratio, fixed interval, variable ratio, and variable interval. So ratio is dependent on how many times or things that you do, while interval is based on a time schedule. And then fixed things are like every this many things, this happens, while variable is it's random. So there are some good examples of that, those schedules. Moving on. Okay, there's also social observational learning. So this is learning by watching others. So this man named Albert Bandura did an experiment called the Bobo doll experiment. So basically what happened was that children were shown a video of adults beating up and punching this Bobo doll. So this Bobo doll is basically like a punching bag or something that allows you, like, if you hit it, it just like stands right back up. That's basically what it is. So they showed this child this video of this Bobo doll being punched and kicked, and then they brought the child into a room with a Bobo doll along with a bunch of other toys. Albert Bandura then took all the toys away, which made the children usually upset, and then these upset children usually like mimic the adults by also punching and kicking this Bobo doll. Kids who didn't see the video usually didn't react in this way. which showed that children learn by watching others. Sorry. So now we're moving on to cognitive psychology. So this is all about like thinking and memory. Specifically, memory is really important in this. So memory consists of 3 basic steps. So there's encoding, retention, and then recall, or just like remembering it. So there's getting it into your brain, making sure it stays there, and then being able to bring it back out when you need the information. So there are different types of encoding. So there's automatic encoding, which is stuff that is usually asked like, oh, what did you have for breakfast? That's automatic. You didn't have to work to remember. Like when you're eating breakfast, you're not like, oh my God, I need to remember this. But there's effortful encoding, which requires intention and effort to be able to remember this information. This is very applicable to schoolwork because you have to effortfully like remember and memorize things that you need for school. There's also stuff, chunking is a very big way of how to remember stuff. Mnemonics, like acronyms. PEMDAS is very important for like order of operations. You learn that in like 5th grade. And then there's also like method of loci, which is using locations to help you remember a list of items in order. This is not as used as often, but it's still an interesting way of doing so. Then there's storage, being able to retain this information over time. This is the second step. So you have your sensory memory, which includes iconic memory and echoic memory. So it lasts like not that long, so like a couple seconds at most. So it's like your visual memory and your auditory memory. Then you have your short-term memory, which is information from the sensory memory to the short-term memory. So it lasts about 30 seconds and can help you remember 5 to 9 items, so 7 plus or minus 2. So rehearsal can help you remember this for longer. This example, like short-term memory, is like if you're trying to remember a phone number, you'll just like keep on repeating it over and over in your head until you're able to type it out, and then you'll forget it. Then you have long-term memory, which it typically lasts an entire lifetime. So you have explicit, which is you have to consciously memorize and recall it, and then there's implicit, which is unconscious. So implicit is usually like riding a bike or something you'll like implicitly remember with like muscle memory. While explicit is usually like stuff like events or facts. So memory is organized into hierarchies. So they're semantic networks, so how memories are all linked together. So the big thing is long-term potentiation. So the more you like repeat this fact, or the more you think about this, like something you need to learn, the more you study it, the more your neurons will fire, and then the better you will be able to remember this. So then there's retrieval. Sorry, being able to take information out of the storage in your memory. So these are some important terms, as well as they're pretty interesting. So there's serial position effect, which is basically you tend to remember things better when they're at the beginning or the end of the list. So that means like if you're going in for like this is not necessarily true, but like if you're going into like for a job, if you're trying to get a job or something, try to go first instead of going in the middle, because they may remember you better this way, like a job interview. Also, recall is when you're told without cues, when you're forced to remember something. So like if you had a fill in the blank question on a test, while recognition is something like multiple choice. So you have cues, you have answer choices, and then it'll help you remember what you've been told, what you're trying to learn. Flashbulb memories are just like super vivid events, memories of events in your brain. So like if you're alive for 9/11, that would be super ingrained in your memory. And then there's encoding failure, which is you forgetting information because you didn't actually encode it or pay attention to it in the first place. For example, on the picture on the right, you can see how it's asking which is the real penny. So as you can tell, it's kind of hard to know which one's a real penny if you never actually like specifically studied it. Okay, we're running out of time. I'll try to talk faster. So this is more memory stuff. So like repressed memories, they're buried there, so they're not usually reliable. They're usually because of like some sort of defense mechanism where you don't want to remember this for a reason, for your health or something. And then there's forgetting curve, which is by Ebbinghaus. Memory errors, there's proactive interference where old memories will block new memories. For example, if you are learning a dance and there's a similar dance before and you start remembering the old dance instead of the new one. And then there's retroactive interference with new blocks old. So if you're learning so much new information that you forget the stuff that you learned previously. Then there's amnesia and Alzheimer's disease, which is a pretty big subject. Okay, so I'm not going to go over this. I don't think I have enough time for that, but this is just terms for thinking. And I do think here functional fixedness is interesting because like the picture on the right, if you're given matches, a box of tacks, and a candle and asked to be able to attach the candle to a wall, most people can't think of it unless they know the solution. So you can use the box of tacks, which most people don't think of because they're like, oh, it's just a box. It's just what the tacks are contained in. That's what functional fixedness is. It's just not being able to think outside of the box. Okay, developmental is basically like children's psychology. That's basically it. So there are 3 different theories, big theories of development. So first one is John Piaget. So basically there are 4 stages. There's sensory motor, pre-operational, concrete operational, and formal operational. So in the sensory motor stage, you're mostly focused around, it's when you're very, very small. It's when babies lack object permanence. So like, that's why they cry if like their parents leave them in a room because they think that if they can't see it, the thing doesn't exist anymore. This is why peekaboo is amusing to them. Then there's pre-operational, which lack of conservation. So basically the picture on the right, you can see how the 2 same cups, one is put in a wide container while one is put in a skinny container. A toddler in the pre-operational stage wouldn't be able to recognize that these are the same amount of liquid. They'd be like, oh, the one on the tall glass is more because it's taller or something like that. Then they can't reverse like things like math equations. For example, if you ask them what's 4 plus 2 and they say 6, and then you ask what's 2 plus 4, they have to think again and then come back to the term of 6. Also, they're egocentric, which means they can't distinguish their own perspective from another person. For example, if you have a toddler in the pre-operational stage and ask them to buy a present, for example, if they like dolls, they might be like, oh, this other person also likes dolls, like if they're asked to buy something for a parent, because they think everybody thinks from their own perspectives. Concrete and formal operational aren't that interesting. Like they don't have any specific things that you probably need to remember. Then there's Kohlberg's moral development. This is not as iconic as Piaget's. There's some memes we were forced to make in this class a year ago. Then there's Erikson. There's socio-emotional. He basically organized it in like something versus something else. So basically, you have to pass each stage to get to the next stage, and if you don't, then you have like problems or something. There are like a lot of them, and I don't think they're that important for it. Okay, then there's motivation, emotion, and personality. So theories of motivation are obviously instinct, also drive reduction, which is stuff for like if you're hungry, you want to reduce that hunger. And then there's optimum arousal, which is basically like why we go on roller coasters, because we want to arouse ourselves and yeah. Okay, then you have Maslow's hierarchy of needs. So this is very important for psychology. We learned about this for a long time. So it's basically how Maslow, this guy named Abraham Maslow, said that basically our entire goal is to get to self-actualization, which is achieving our full potential. But to get there, we would have to have all of the things in the pyramid below it, like obviously physical needs, like food and water, and then like love and everything else until we get to self-actualization. This is a big unit in psychology about hunger and how this works. It's a lot, and I'm not going to be going into it. Here's some like basic stuff. There's emotion. So like why we have emotion and how it works. So people thought that it would be like, oh, we have a stimulus and then our body has some reaction and then it goes to emotion, or we have a stimulus and our body reacts and with the emotion simultaneously, or we have a stimulus and then our body reacts and then we have to interpret the stimulus in our brain before we can have our emotion. The general adaptation syndrome is for stress. It's pretty interesting. So it's basically how your body responds to stress. So first there's alarm, where you freak out, and then there's resistance, where you deal with it, and then there's exhaustion, which is basically the end and it's burnout. We talked about this dude earlier, Sigmund Freud. He was again, he cared about the unconscious a lot. So he thought that our personality was made up of our id, our superego, and our ego. Id being like your wants and desires, like your raw, like animalistic stuff. So this is like what babies have. Like if you ask them for like, do you want a cookie now or 2 cookies later, they'll probably say a cookie now instead of focusing on a long term. They work on pleasure and pain principle, which means like right now in the moment. Then there's the super ego, which is like the super good stuff, your angel on your shoulder. And then there's the ego, which deals with society. It has to mediate between your id and your super ego. So when the ego cannot maintain this balance, we use defense mechanisms. So these are all defense mechanisms are the way like your mind like changes or something to prevent yourself from like having problems. For example, if like something you like have like denial is a big one. It's like somebody tells you have cancer, you might go through this stage of denial, so refusing to acknowledge reality because maybe your brain just can't comprehend that. So there are a lot of these defense mechanisms. Then there's trait perspective. This is stuff like personality traits, stuff you do when you take any personality test like the MBTI or the MMPA or MMPI, my bad. And then the Myers-Briggs, very big tests. Myers-Briggs is the one that gives you like INFJ or ENPT or something like that. Those are really big tests now, but they're not entirely accurate because they're too broad. Then there's the humanistic perspective of this. So basically it emphasizes your personal growth and free will. I don't think this is as important as the previous one, but basically the problem is that it's like way too optimistic, and then the abstract concept of like being able to grow is really difficult to test. Then there's social cognitive, which is basically behavior and your cognition and then your environment work together to develop your personality. So this is probably the most accurate, but like it's very hard to test because of, I'll get to it in the next slide, but basically everything is dependent on your cognitive desires, your behavior, and your environment. So it's hard because it's very specific, and it's hard to test because you have to observe and have interviews and these really time-consuming tasks. So this is why it's not used about as much. Getting to the end, clinical psychology is unit 8. So okay, clinical psychology is a pretty big topic. It's basically any sort of disorders, so psychological disorders, which are a very interesting part of psychology. And then so firstly it's like you have to test your individual and then see your abnormal behavior, and then you have to diagnose it so you can treat this. There are a lot of interesting psychological disorders that you can go and study. So yeah. Then there's social psychology, which is the last unit we'll be going over today. And it's basically studies how we think, influence, and relate to one another. So in social psychology, there are a lot of very interesting experiments. For example, there is this role-playing one, which is called the Zimbardo, the Stanford Prison Experiment, conducted by this guy named Zimbardo. So basically, he taught a college class, and he split them up randomly and assigned them to be either guards or prisoners. And then drove for like a certain amount of time. So during this time, people started actually developing role appropriate attitudes, meaning like the guards would sometimes actually go in and like beat the prisoners or talk down to them, and the prisoners would be like reclusive and like afraid, as if they were actually prisoners, but they weren't, and they weren't actually guards. This experiment eventually had to be shut down because of ethical problems. So yeah, it got pretty bad. There's also a couple of phenomenons which are funny. So like foot in the door phenomenon. So basically, for example, if you're asking for money, you can start with a small one, and eventually you can, once people start complying with you, you can start asking for more and more and more. So if you ask for like $5 one day, and then like the next week you ask for $25, like for $10, and it gets all the way up, you can ask more and more, because having one foot in the door can help you bring the rest of your body through. There's also this other phenomenon that's not listed, and it's also not tested, but it's called door in the face. Basically, you just start with like a super big amount of money that's not even going to happen, some super big request, and then like bring it down so that it seems not as much in comparison. There's also a pretty interesting one where this social influence. So this is a very big part of psychology, because you have to communicate with people, and the way people perceive you is important to how you think of yourself. So for example, conformity. This person did an experiment, this Ash guy did an experiment where he showed so everybody was in the experiment, on the experiment, except for one person, and then they would show like stuff that's very obviously wrong, and everybody else would give the wrong answer, and then this last person would be asked to give the right answer and see if they were asked then to give the answer, and then they would see if they would conform with the other people who gave the wrong answer, or would actually go out and say the right answer. It shows how conformity affects us. There's also stuff like obedience, which is an experiment done by Milgram. So basically what happened was patients were asked to shock another person dialing up. So people weren't actually shocked, weren't actually physically shocked, but there was an actor who was like scream or something to mimic as if they were being shocked, and it was seeing how many people would just be obedient to what they were told and administer a lethal shock to another person just because they were told to. This resulted in like 60% of participants administering lethal shocks. And then usually when you are planning on not doing it, like the people who opted out would opt out early instead of in the middle or later. Because if you're going to go through a little bit, most people just go through the entire thing. There's also a bunch of other like social, like group influence, like peer pressure and stuff, but that's a bit deep. Also, we're basically out of time, and this is my entire slideshow. Okay. I don't think I have anything else to talk about. Also, it's 8 now, so thank you for coming. I don't think there'll be any questions about what I talked about in general, but thank you for coming. If you would like a copy of the slide, just email me and I can send it to you. I think this would be most helpful if you were wanting to